simple animation like this one. Oops, where'd you go? Great. We'll walk you through moving from a simple animation like this one to one in which we can have a number of objects. And what we're going to be doing is moving from a single object to a list of objects. So first, a quick code walkthrough. It's kind of three key parts of this code. First of all, we have an animate function, which runs 60 times a second, or as often as the browser wants us to. That animate function here calculates how long has gone by, and then it calls an update square, which updates our square with the, and then draw square, which draws the square. So update square updates an x and a y value. The square itself is just an object here with an x, a y, and a size, which get drawn. And then update just changes them. I could also, for example, have the size change. So if I now I've got a square that gets bigger and bigger. So lots of options there. Here, I'm going to make my square pop back down to 5 now. There we go. So now the square grows until it pops. There we go. Lovely. And then the draw square just draws. This is a very basic drawing. It just draws at x and y. Obviously, in your real games, your drawing would be more complicated. Your updating would be more complicated. All of that logic could be more complicated. But what I'm going to demonstrate here is just how we go from a single object to a bunch of objects. So the basic concept is, instead of just having a square like that, I'm going to make a list. So in this case, I'll just call it squares, but you could call it a list of whatever you wanted. And then that list could just have your square in it. So I could just do square like that, or I can literally copy that object literal and paste it in like that. To sort of show that I'm doing something different, I'm going to start by just putting 2 object literals in. They're going to start at 2 different points and have 2 different sizes. So right now I've got a let's square. I'm going to delete that. That's going to break my code because my code won't work without it. Should break. There we go. Now I have let's square. So instead of 1 square, I change it to a plural. And I made a list by using these square brackets. And a list in JavaScript can just be square bracket and then any number of values. So those could be objects, they could be strings, they could be numbers. In this case, each value is going to be an object representing a square on the screen. So I've got an x, a y, and then a size of my square. You could have all different, you might have angles, you might have any attributes you cared about tracking. You could put in that list. And now when I come to my update, all of my functions are going to have to change. So I'm just going to change these. Just good habit is just to change the names to be plurals if they're going to deal with plurals. So I'm going to change my update square to update squares and my draw square to draw squares. And whereas before I just updated 1 square, now I'm just going to take this same logic and I'm going to call squares for each.
Attention please. All students that take the Tinkerbell bus should be dismissed now. Thank you.
And squares for each is going to run the code inside of it with each square in my list. So the way I read this squares for each is for every square in my list, I call this other function. Now my square function is going to take the y, the x, and the size. In fact, I can copy exactly the same logic I had before, but instead of running on a single square, I'm now running on every square in the list, and I'm updating. And I'm going to do something very similar with draw squares. I'm going to come to draw squares, and I'm going to call squares for each. I'm going to make a new function, and I can just copy paste my old code inside. So this is what we call refactoring when you're changing your code around in this way. And let's see how we did. Not so well. So I've made a mistake. I actually know what it is. I'll show you the mistake. The mistake is that I clear the rectangle each time in my original. So I actually want to clear the drawing once, and only once, and then draw all of the squares. So now I'm clearing the drawing, and I'm drawing all the squares, and lo and behold, I have 2 squares showing up. So that's pretty good. If I wanted to make 3 squares, all I have to do is add a third object here. So I could add one at 300, y, 200, size, 40, and as soon as it's got all the attributes it needs, oops, what did I do? Oh, I left the comma off. Commas between object elements. Okay, where'd it go? Interesting. Did it go away? 100. There we go. Now there's 3. Now I've got 3 squares and they're all following the same logic. It's very simple. I made a list of objects, and then in my update I go for each, and this runs once for each item in my list. And then draw squares also runs once for each item in my list. Let me just show you one other kind of cool thing. If I wanted to make it so that clicking added a new square, I can go ahead and say canvas, add event listener, click, function event. So when they click, right, add a new square, right? So we're just going to say, okay, fine. When they click, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say squares push is how we push a new item onto a list or an array, and I'm going to push x event offset x, y event offset y, size 20. All right, assuming I wrote that code correctly. Yep, now I can make new squares by clicking, and they stick around. All right, all set.